Hello, my name is Fabian Fernandez. I'm a nutrient management specialist at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. Today, I will talk a little bit about the research that I have been conducting in irrigated sands. I will start by talking about some of the older research that is getting older, I guess. I started at the University of Minnesota in 2013. And then I will talk about the research that we are currently conducting with cover crops. And then I will finish the presentation by talking a little bit about the future of the research that I am conducting. One of the first things that I was interested in looking at when I arrived to the University of Minnesota was the effect of best management practices. In this particular study, it was done over 4 years. I was looking at nitrogen source and timing of application. The first part here shows different nitrogen sources all applied at pre-plant. And then this second half of the treatment shows a split application. All of these were done at only 120 pounds of nitrogen. The reason I chose a low nitrogen rate is so that we would be in the most responsive portion of the nitrogen response curve, so that if there were changes due to these treatments, we would easily pick them up. What we see here is these pre-plant treatments all applied at 120 pounds. We were using either anhydrous ammonia with N-serve, different blends of ESN, which is a polymer coated urea, and urea. And then for the split applications, we apply 40 pounds pre-plant, and then the remaining 80 pounds, we apply that these different development stages, B2, 4, 6, 8, or 12. And what we saw here is that any of these pre-plant applications, some of the sources were better than others, especially better than urea, ESN, and anhydrous ammonia with N-serve seem to be the better ones. But none of them were as good as some of these later split applications. And so the split application definitely is a best management practice for irrigated sands. Now, in a different study, we were interested in actually getting a full response curve to nitrogen. And so we had different nitrogen rates in here from 0 to about 280 pounds of nitrogen. And we applied those as a single pre-plant application or a split application with 40 pounds applied pre-plant, and then around the B8, B9 stage, we apply the rest of the nitrogen to match the corresponding single pre-plant nitrogen rates, or just so that we could see if we were maybe starving the plant if we applied only 40 pounds. We also had a different set of treatments where we apply 80 pounds pre-plant, and then the remaining nitrogen around B8, B9. And what you see here is very clear that the pre-plant application is inferior to either one of the split applications. So in irrigated sands, the split application is really a best management practice. It's much better than even trying to apply some of the enhanced efficiency fertilizers that we saw in the previous slide. In addition to best management practices, for yield, purely interested in yield, the other part that is very important is that these sandy soils tend to be very important for environmental reasons. We know that nitrate leaching is a substantial concern in the state. And so another thing that we are looking at very intensively is not only the agricultural, agronomic aspects of crop production, but also the environmental aspects. This study, we started it in 2011 in Polk County in Westport. And it's a partnership that we have with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. In this study, in 2011, we set up a few cropping systems, a continuous corn system, and then a corn soybean system with both crops present every year. The other thing that is very unique about this project is that underneath many of these plots, as you can see here with these PVC pipes coming out of the ground, we have lysimeters installed. These lysimeters allow us to look at the nitrate concentrations that are below the root zone. So basically the nitrate that reaches below the root zone and that eventually will make its way down to groundwater. One of the things that we were looking at in here is how much nitrogen is leached when we have different nitrogen grades. And what you see here is just one example. This was done over many years for all these different rotations that I showed you previously. And so this is just one example, but what we have in here is the pounds of nitrate nitrogen per acre that were lost through below the root zone that we were measuring through these lysimeters. And then we also have the cumulative drainage in inches, which is represented by this black line right here. The different colors represent the different nitrogen grades in pounds per acre. And so we see that obviously as we increase the amount of nitrogen, we tend to increase the amount of nitrate leaching that occurs. But the other thing that was very interesting from this study is that when we look at the growing season, the majority of nitrogen loss and drainage happen in the spring during May and June. On average, again, this is just 1 year showing here, but on average, 75% of the drainage and 73% of the nitrate load occurred during that May-June period, which is telling us that this is the most critical period to manage nitrogen correctly. And even early split applications may not produce the benefits that we want because we may still be applying nitrogen too early and it may be subject to loss. So that's one of the things that we learned from this study. The other thing that I want to point your attention to is this check plot where we apply no nitrogen. And we see here that there is nitrate leaching occurring even in these plots where we have no nitrogen. And so this is, I think, a very important finding because it points out to the fact that even if we are managing nitrogen correctly or even not applying any nitrogen, there will be some loss of nitrate to the environment. And so the idea here is then to, with these annual cropping systems where the crops are not growing year round, is to find ways in which we can improve productivity and reduce the environmental impact of agriculture. Now, one of the questions then is why do we see why do we see these amounts of nitrate coming out of these plots with no nitrogen? And this is a very interesting question. So we looked at, as I mentioned, we started the study in 2011. So between 2011 and 2019, as an average for the three systems, continuous corn, corn soybean, and soybean corn, these are the concentrations on average that we get, concentrations of nitrate nitrogen below the root zone. And this is the cumulative annual load in pounds per acre. So 30 pounds of nitrate nitrogen in continuous corn, 77 pounds on average for corn soybean, and 42 pounds in the soybean side of that rotation. So pretty large amounts of nitrogen coming out. And keep in mind that these were from plots that had not received any nitrogen since 2011. And we've been cropping those all these years. The other interesting thing is that these values actually were very stable throughout the year. So that's why I made an average across all the years. And if we look at these values compared to the EONR and the amount of nitrate leaching that occurs at the economic optimum end rate for these rotations, these values basically represent about 40% of the loading that we see in continuous corn and about 81% of the loading that occurs in corn soybean when we are applying an economic optimum nitrogen rate. Now, where is this nitrogen coming from? One of the things that is interesting about this particular site, it is that while it is a sandy soil, it has quite a bit of organic matter. It has 4.5% organic matter. So organic matter, of course, the mineralization can provide quite a bit of nitrogen. And this is what we see in these graphs right here. We have for the different rotations for continuous corn, corn soybean, and soybean corn. We did an incubation study where we incubated soils for a number of days. And these soils came from plots where they had the check plot, where they received no nitrogen, or where they received the highest nitrogen rate that we applied, 280 pounds of nitrogen. And so in this incubation study, we are looking at under ideal conditions, how much nitrogen these soils can provide. And you see that we are looking at 200 or more here in the soybean phase, anywhere from about 100 to over 200 pounds per acre per year of nitrogen that can be provided in this corn soybean rotation. And then in the continuous corn, anywhere from about a little bit over 100 to about close to 200 pounds. So substantial amounts of nitrogen that can be mineralized from the soil organic matter. And so that can lead to pretty substantial amounts of nitrogen loss, even if we apply no nitrogen, and especially in these systems, again, that are annual cropping systems where we have no crop growing early in the season. And as I showed earlier, about 75% of the leaching and the concentrations of the loading that occurs for the whole growing season happen during that early part of the season. So quite a bit of that could even be nitrogen that is mineralized, but because the crops are not there to use it, they can leach below the root zone. And so with this study, one of the things that we were able to do is because we had a series of response curves with many different nitrogen rates, we could look at the economic optimum end rate and then look at how much nitrogen is lost through this leaching process at the economic optimum. And then we can also draw some scenarios where we can say, okay, we know exactly how much nitrogen we needed to optimize the production of this system. What if we reduce the amount of nitrogen needed, and what kind of benefit will we get? So what we are looking here is for the two systems with where we apply nitrogen, continuous corn and the corn side of the corn soybean rotation. And for continuous corn, here we have the economic optimum end rate was 223 pounds of nitrogen. The yield at that economic optimum was 189 bushels. And this is the amount of nitrate nitrogen that was leached below the root zone at that economic optimum end rate. So if we say, okay, what if we reduce the rate by 20%? What we are looking at here is instead of applying to 123 pounds, we will reduce it to 179 pounds. And with that, we will basically reduce the yield by 4% and the nitrate leaching by 9%. So even though we reduced nitrate leaching, it was pretty minimum, and we are also starting to reduce yield. Or if we go even more aggressive and say 25% reduction from the economic optimum, now we are at 167, and we are reducing the yield by 6% and the amount of nitrate leaching by 11%. So again, not a reduction in nitrate leaching that will be sufficient to take care of some of the environmental issues related to nitrate leaching. And that was for the continuous corn side. For corn soybean, even though I calculated those values, when we did the regression, there was actually no statistical difference for the corn soybean rotation. So in essence, what we see here is that reducing the nitrogen rate from the economic optimum is not really going to provide the benefits that we are looking for. Now, if we are over applying nitrogen way more than what we need to optimize the crop, then at that point, yes, that will be a substantial benefit because additional nitrogen above the economic optimum is not going to increase yield. So the farmer will lose revenue. He will be paying for nitrogen. The farmer will be paying for nitrogen that doesn't improve yield or income. And we will be losing quite a bit of nitrogen to the environment. So with all these things in mind, then the question really becomes, if we are doing everything as best as we can with nitrogen management, we are applying the right amount of nitrogen, we are applying nitrogen like we did in this study, what else can we do to minimize the environmental impact of these corn cropping systems? That's where this study has kind of evolved from that initial phase. Now we are in a second phase where we are looking at the effect of cover crops. We have Corn and it's still the same rotations as before. We haven't changed that. We still have the lysimeters, but now we have rye as a cover crop that we plant in the fall, and then we terminate in the spring before planting, and then we have excuse me, a living mulch of Pura clover. That it's because it's a living mulch, the system we had to change it from conventional tillage to strip till so that we can do the strip till in the spring, and between the rows we still have the Pura clover that is a living mulch. The different treatments that we have for this study are a series of nitrogen rates from 0 to 270 pounds of nitrogen. This nitrogen is applied in 3 splits. So we divide this total rate by 3 and we apply it from B2, around B2, around B6, B7, and around B10. For these nitrogen rates, we have rye cover crop that we terminate in the spring. We also have the same rates with no rye cover crop, so we can have that comparison. And then at 2 rates, 0 and 225 pounds of nitrogen in continuous corn, or 0 and 180 pounds in corn soybean, we have this Pura clover living mulch. Now, these 2 rates, the 225 and the 180, are the rates which we have observed at this particular site that are around the economic optimum for these cropping systems. Now, with these treatments in place, our objectives were to quantify the effect of winter rye cover crop and Pura clover living mulch on nitrate leaching. But the other part, of course, is the agronomic aspects to see if having this living mulch or the rye cover crop, how that affected the amount of nitrogen needed to optimize the yield. And let me say that, well, these systems are very important and can help us. They don't come for free. There is a lot of management that has to be done with them. Here are just a few pictures to illustrate some of the points. We have the major concern or difficulty that we have with rye is the establishment in the fall. Some years we get very nice establishment, but then there are some years where either the establishment wasn't very good in the fall, or maybe a well-established fall crop, but then in the spring there was not very much rye to show for or to take up nitrogen. The other part is that with Pura clover, as I mentioned, now we have to use strip till, so it takes a little bit more skill, if you will, and different equipment. And then the other thing that we have done is, in order to minimize the amount of competition with the crop, is that we have done suppression, mechanical suppression, as well as chemical suppression with glyphosate. Now, when we look at the nitrate leaching under these systems, here what you're looking at is the nitrate concentrations from 2016 to 2019 as an average. The first table shows all of the nitrogen rates that we have in the study with rye versus no rye that we have lysimeter data or nitrate leaching data from. And these values here, when they are followed by the same ladder, it indicates that they are not statistically different. If they have different ladders, it means that there was a statistical difference. And then here, it will be the comparison of rye versus no rye. We have the 3 rotations: continuous corn, corn soybean, and soybean corn. So when we look at nitrogen rate first, we observe that in general, both in continuous corn and corn soybean, where we apply nitrogen, as we increase the amount of nitrogen that we apply from the check to the economic optimum, both in corn soybean or in continuous corn, to the highest rate, we see an increase typically in the amount of concentrations that we observe. In the soybean phase, where we are just basically looking at the residual effect of nitrogen applied in the previous corn crop, we see no statistical difference. And then in this bottom table, what we are looking at is a comparison of the three systems here for the cover crop, rye, nor-rye, and the Kira clover. Of course, for this, as I mentioned earlier, we only have two nitrogen rates that we are comparing. So all of these three systems, rye, nor-rye, and Kira, are being compared here for the exact same amount of nitrogen. And we see here that in continuous corn, there was no difference between any of these three in terms of the concentrations. But in corn soybean and the soybean corn rotation, we see that Kira clover actually has a reduction in the amount of nitrate concentrations. When we compare the rye nor-rye average to the Cura, we see that Cura reduced the concentrations by 52% in continuous corn, 73% in corn soybean, and 72% in soybean corn. So, and this value, of course, there is a lot of variability, even though there is no statistical difference, we see that there is a huge reduction in the concentration. We'll talk now a little bit about the amount of nitrogen as a load. So we are now looking at pounds of nitrate nitrogen per acre that are reached below the root zone. Again, following the same format for this average data from 2016 to 2019, we have continuous corn, corn soybean, and soybean corn. And we observed that there was really no much difference between the different nitrogen rates here when we have rye and nor-rye. At least when we compare the check in continuous corn and in soybean, we observed that they were lower loading than the highest end rate. But if we compare the economic optimum to the highest end rate, in both situations, we observed that there were no statistical differences, although numerically, again, the continuous corn seems that it's much higher, but not so much in the corn soybean rotation. The other interesting thing is that in soybean, even though we are applying no nitrogen, we see that these values are pretty high, sometimes even higher than some of the values that we observed in the corn soybean rotation side. And then when we look at rye versus nor-rye versus Cura, so the bottom graphs, we observed that rye basically had no impact on the loading. Those values were with or without rye were very similar. But Cura clover substantially reduced the amount of loading. If we average these two values of rye versus nor-rye, and we compare those to Cura clover, we observe that Cura reduced the loading by 66% in continuous corn, 79% in corn soybean, and 77% in the soybean side of that rotation. So a substantial benefit in terms of Cura clover really being a scavenger for nitrogen and reducing the loading that we are seeing. Now, of course, the other part to this study, or the other side of the coin, if you will, is the agronomic performance of these crops. So in this top table here, we are seeing the nitrogen rates for rye versus nor-rye. Now, of course, we have a few additional nitrogen rates because we didn't have lysimeters installed in all of these plots, but we do have the yield for all of these plots. And we see that with increasing nitrogen rate, we increase the amount of yield for continuous corn, corn soybean. There was no statistical difference here for soybean, so soybean was not really impacted by the residual nitrogen from the previous corn crop. But there was no difference with the rye in terms of rye nor-rye. There was no difference in the yield. When we look at the effect of these three systems with rye nor-rye and the Cura clover, again, we observed that there were no differences with the rye nor-rye. Cura clover had a substantial impact in the yield. It substantially reduced the yield. If we look at continuous corn, we look here at a 36% reduction in yield compared to the average of the rye nor-rye, 38% in corn soybean, and even in the soybean side of things, 19% reduction in the yield. So while Cura clover can be a very good scavenger of nitrate and reduces the leaching load that we measure, Unfortunately, we also see that it's a high competitor for nitrogen for the cash crops. And so we are looking right now at ways to minimize the impact of the Cura in terms of the competition. So we are trying to manage Cura more aggressively so that we suppress it early in the spring more aggressively than we have been doing. We have been using a low dose of glyphosate, and this last year, I don't have the data here, but last year in 2020, we actually used a full dose of glyphosate in the row, and that seemed to have helped. We still have some competition. It's better. We don't have as much competition, but still there is some competition. So we are still trying to figure ways in which we can suppress Cura sufficient so that it reduces the amount of competition with the cash crop. But at the same time, we want to maintain the benefit of scavenging nitrate early in the spring so that we minimize the amount of nitrate loading. And then when we look at the economic optimum end rate, this is just for rye and not rye because we have a number of nitrogen rates that we can have a response curve and be able to calculate these things. We don't have enough end rates for the Cura clover, unfortunately, to do this kind of analysis. But here we are looking at the economic optimum end rate for the in continuous corn and in corn soybean for rye and not rye. The red bars represent the economic optimum end rate, and the yellow bar represents the yield at the economic optimum. And so we see in continuous corn that um, when we have rye, we actually need more nitrogen to get to the economic optimum to produce about the same yield. And in corn soybean, there is not much difference on average in terms of the economic optimum end rate and the yield. But in reality, in 1 year only, out of all the years between 2016 and 2019, we observed that there was no need for additional nitrogen. So even in the corn soybean rotation, we see that there is a need for additional nitrogen when we have rye. On average for the corn soybean was about 12 pounds of nitrogen more needed in order to get to that economic optimum. And this is average across both the corn and corn soybean rotation, with rye 209 pounds versus 199 with no rye, and then similar yields in terms of the yield at the economic optimum. So a little bit of a problem because the rye didn't really benefit us in terms of reducing nitrate leaching, and it results in additional nitrogen needed to optimize the yield. So with that, a few of the key points for this presentation is that split nitrogen applications are superior to single applications, even when we are using enhanced efficiency fertilizers. We cannot use enhanced efficiency fertilizers as a single pre-plant application and expect that we will do well. Most likely we will lose yield, we will lose nitrogen. When we are using best management practices for nitrogen, there is nitrate that will continue to be leaching below the root zone. And so how do we minimize that? Reducing the nitrogen rate below the economic optimum may sound or seem like a potential way to do that, but the research shows clearly that that is not going to solve the environmental issues, and it actually results in a reduction in production. And so with the current project, we are looking at the winter rye and the Cura clover. The biggest concern that we have with winter rye is, as a cover crop, is that it produced no benefit in reducing nitrate loading. And it had the good thing is that it had no impact on grain yield, but we needed to have additional nitrogen, a little bit more nitrogen in order to optimize that yield. So there is no a great benefit in there. One of the challenges and one of the things that we are hoping to try to improve is to find ways to establish rye better and to have a better crop in the spring before we terminate it. Because like I mentioned, it's kind of a hit and miss thing. Some years it's good, some years it's not so good. In terms of Cura clover, we had a substantial reduction in nitrate leaching, so that's a great success story. but it came to a very high cost in terms of production because we reduced yields substantially. So we need to look at, and that's what we are doing now, is looking more at ways to minimize that competition with the cash crops. So this brings me to our future work. We again need to refine QR clover management so that it doesn't compete as heavily with the cash crop, but it retains the ability to scavenge nitrate early in the spring. We are also very interested in understanding the nitrogen cycle processes better, because there is definitely some benefits that can be gained by having these cover crops in place, but we need to understand the the processes. And so we are looking at mineralization and immobilization with rye and Kira clover in these cropping systems. We are also interested in looking at soil health measurements where we have these rotations and these covers now for a few years. So we hope that we'll be able to start to look at some of the potential impacts and benefits of these systems now that we have a few years. And then the other things that we are interested in understanding more is other loss path mechanisms. So far, we have been really focused on nitrate leaching, but when you add cover crops into a rotation, there may be other loss mechanisms that we are not really measuring or we don't know much about, specifically loss mechanisms to the atmosphere, whether it's nitrous oxide emissions or ammonia emissions that are potent greenhouse gases. So that's where we are right now. I just would like to conclude by saying thanks to a great number of people. The presentation that I gave today is really an effort that has been going on for a number of years with many, many individuals. And it would not be possible to have done all of this if we weren't for a very dedicated group of people that have helped me with all of these projects. And finally, the funding for these projects have been done by many of these organizations and groups. Thank you very much.